The morning of December 7th, 1941, dawned clear and peaceful over the Hawaiian Islands. Petty Officer 3rd Class Samuel Mitchell stood watch aboard the USS Arizona, his coffee growing cold as he gazed across the tranquil waters of Pearl Harbor. The battleship Roe stretched before him like a steel city floating on the Pacific. 9 massive warships of the United States Navy's Pacific Fleet anchored in perfect formation. The Arizona, the Nevada, the Oklahoma, the West Virginia, the California, the Tennessee, the Maryland, and the Pennsylvania, each one a testament to American naval power, their gray hulls gleaming in the early morning sun. Mitchell had no way of knowing that 300 miles to the north, a Japanese strike force was preparing to unleash hell upon this peaceful scene. Admiral Kiichi Nagumo's First Air Fleet, consisting of 6 aircraft carriers and their escort vessels, had been steaming toward Hawaii for 10 days under strict radio silence. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shikaku, and Zuikaku carried within their hangars the instruments of America's entry into World War II. At Ford Island Naval Air Station, Lieutenant Commander Logan Ramsey was beginning his morning routine, unaware that Japanese pilots were already climbing into their cockpits. Aboard the carriers of the Kito Butai Strike Force, the first wave of attack aircraft, 183 planes in total, had been launched at 6 o'clock that morning. Their Nakajima B-5 and Kate torpedo bombers, Aichi D-3 Aval dive bombers, and Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters, cutting through the dawn sky with deadly precision. According to historical records from the National Archives, the Japanese had been planning this attack for months, with Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor strike, believing that a devastating blow to the American Pacific Fleet would give Japan the breathing room it needed to establish dominance in the Pacific theater. Commander Mitsuo Fukita, leading the first wave from his Kate bomber, peered through his cockpit window at the approaching coastline of Oahu. Below him, the island appeared peaceful and unprepared. American radar operators at the Opana Point Station had detected the approaching aircraft at 7:02 that morning, but their warning had been dismissed by duty officers who assumed the radar signatures belonged to a flight of American B-17 Flying Fortress bombers expected to arrive from the mainland. On the ground at Pearl Harbor, Seaman First Class James Ward was preparing for Sunday morning church services aboard the USS Oklahoma. The Oklahoma, a Nevada-class battleship launched in 1916, was moored at Battleship Roe alongside her sister ships. Ward had joined the Navy 2 years earlier, seeking adventure and steady pay during the difficult economic times that still lingered from the Great Depression. Like thousands of other young Americans serving in the Pacific, he had viewed his posting to Hawaii as a tropical paradise assignment, far removed from the growing conflicts in Europe and Asia. The harbor was unusually quiet that morning, with many servicemen either attending religious services or enjoying their Sunday liberty. The USS Arizona's band was scheduled to perform at a Battle of the Bands competition later that day, and many crew members were looking forward to the entertainment. The peaceful atmosphere was punctuated only by the gentle lapping of waves against the massive steel hulls and the occasional call of seabirds wheeling overhead. As the morning progressed toward 8 o'clock, the final moments of peace were ticking away. Soon, the harbor that had been America's stronghold in the Pacific would become a scene of unprecedented destruction and heroism. At 7:49 in the morning, Commander Fuchida's voice crackled over the radio frequencies of the Japanese strike force. Tora, Tora, Tora. The code words, meaning tiger, 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 confirmed to Admiral Nagumo that complete tactical surprise had been achieved. Below the approaching aircraft, Pearl Harbor lay spread out like a detailed tactical map, with the American Pacific Fleet arranged in perfect vulnerability. The first bombs fell at 7:55, shattering the Sunday morning calm with explosive thunder that would echo through history. Lieutenant Commander Ramsey, standing in the tower at Fort Island, watched in disbelief as the first Japanese aircraft swept down toward the anchored battleships. His immediate radio transmission would become one of the most famous messages in American military history. Air Raid Pearl Harbor X, this is not drill. Aboard the USS Arizona, Petty Officer Mitchell felt the deck shudder beneath his feet as the first wave of Kate torpedo bombers skimmed across the harbor waters at masthead height. The specially modified 16-inch armor-piercing shells, converted into aerial torpedoes for the shallow harbor waters, began finding their marks with devastating precision. The USS Oklahoma, moored outboard of the USS Maryland, took the first torpedo hit at 7:56, followed by 4 more in rapid succession. Seaman Ward, who had been below decks preparing for church services, felt the Oklahoma lurch violently to port as the torpedo explosions tore massive holes in her hull. Water began flooding into the ship's compartments with terrifying speed. The order to abandon ship came within minutes, but for many sailors trapped below decks, escape was impossible. The Oklahoma began her death roll, turning turtle in just 12 minutes, taking 429 officers and men with her to the bottom of the harbor. The USS Arizona became the target of high-level bombing attacks by the Japanese Val dive bombers. At 8:06, a converted 16-inch naval shell, dropped from 10,000 feet by a D-3 of Val, penetrated the Arizona's forward magazine. The explosion that followed was so massive that it lifted the entire forward section of the battleship out of the water before slamming it back down in a twisted mass of steel. The blast killed 1,177 officers and men instantly, including Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd and Captain Franklin Van Valkenburg, both of whom were posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. According to documentation from the USS Arizona Memorial Archives, the explosion was so powerful that it was felt throughout the harbor and could be heard 25 miles away. Burning oil spread across the water, creating a hellish scene that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. On Fort Island, sailors and Marines grabbed whatever weapons they could find. Aviation machinists Mate First Class John Finn, despite being wounded multiple times, manned a machine gun in an exposed position for over 2 hours, firing at Japanese aircraft as they swept past at low altitude. His heroic actions would later earn him the Medal of Honor, the first awarded for actions during the Pearl Harbor attack. The Japanese aircraft seemed to be everywhere at once, their rising sun insignia clearly visible as they pressed home there. Attacks with professional precision. Zero fighters strafed the airfields at Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, and Bellows Field, destroying American aircraft lined up in neat rows on the ground. The P-40 Warhawk fighters and other American aircraft, positioned wingtip to wingtip to prevent sabotage, became easy targets for the Japanese pilots. Commander Fukita, circling above the carnage in his Kate bomber, watched with satisfaction as his carefully planned attack unfolded. The months of training, the detailed intelligence gathering, and the precise timing had paid off beyond his wildest expectations. American resistance was sporadic and disorganized, exactly as Admiral Yamamoto had predicted. Below, in the harbor, the USS West Virginia was listing heavily to port after taking multiple torpedo hits. Her captain, Mervyn Benyon, mortally wounded by shrapnel from an exploding bomb, continued to direct damage control efforts until his death. The USS California, flagship of the Pacific Fleet's battle force, was also taking on water rapidly from torpedo damage. The first wave attack lasted 30 minutes, but to the men under fire, it seemed like hours. As the Japanese aircraft began withdrawing to the north, black smoke billowed from burning ships and oil fires across the harbor. The surprise attack had succeeded beyond Japanese expectations, but the battle for Pearl Harbor was far from over. As the first wave of Japanese aircraft disappeared into the northern sky, a brief lull settled over Pearl Harbor. The harbor was Now a scene of devastation and chaos, with burning ships, billowing smoke, and the cries of wounded men echoing across the water. But the respite was short-lived. At 8:54, air raid sirens began wailing again as the second wave of Japanese aircraft approached from the northwest. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Murata led this second assault, commanding 171 aircraft including 54 high-level bombers, 78 dive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters. Unlike the first wave, which had caught the Americans completely off guard, this second attack faced determined resistance from sailors and soldiers who had recovered from their initial shock. Aboard the USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, Ensign Joseph Taussig Jr. took command of the aft batteries after the ship's senior officers were wounded. Despite having his leg nearly severed by shrapnel, Taussig continued to direct the anti-aircraft fire as the Nevada attempted to escape the harbor. The sight of the great battleship moving through the smoke and flames inspired cheers from men throughout the harbor, but it also drew concentrated Japanese attention. Recognizing that the Nevada might block the harbor entrance if sunk in the Tuvio Channel, Japanese dive bombers pressed home their attacks with renewed fury. Bomb after bomb struck the mighty battleship, starting fires and causing flooding that forced her to beach herself at Hospital Point to avoid sinking in the channel. Taussig's heroic actions would later earn him the Navy Cross, though he would carry the wounds from Pearl Harbor for the rest of his life. The USS Pennsylvania, dry docked for maintenance and repairs, became a primary target for the second-wave bombers. Despite being in dry dock, her crew fought back with everything they had. Bosun's mate, First Class Howard French, manning a .50 caliber machine gun on the Pennsylvania's superstructure, maintained continuous fire against the attacking aircraft, even as bomb fragments wounded him repeatedly. His determination exemplified the spirit of resistance that was beginning to emerge from the chaos. According to wartime records from the Navy Department, the second wave encountered significantly more anti-aircraft fire than the first, as American gunners had recovered from their initial surprise and were now fighting back with deadly determination. However, the Japanese pilots pressed their attacks with the same precision and courage that had characterized the first wave. At Hickam Field, adjacent to Pearl Harbor, the scene was equally devastating. The Japanese had targeted the airfield to prevent American aircraft from interfering with the naval attack. Master Sergeant Lowell Klatt, despite being wounded in the initial strafing attacks, organized rescue efforts for trapped airmen and continued to direct defensive fire against the attacking aircraft. The hangars at Hickam were blazing infernos, with aircraft and equipment worth millions of dollars destroyed in the flames. The destroyer USS Shaw, in floating dry dock for repairs, suffered a catastrophic magazine explosion during the second wave that created one of the most iconic images of the Pearl Harbor attack. The massive explosion, captured by Navy photographers, showed the Shaw's forward section completely destroyed, with debris and smoke towering hundreds of feet above the harbor. Miraculously, the Shaw would later be rebuilt and returned to service, but the dramatic photograph of her destruction became one of the most recognizable images from December 7th. At Wheeler Field, the Army Air Corps' primary fighter base. On Oahu, Lieutenant George Welch and Second Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor managed to reach their P-40 Warhawk fighters despite the ongoing strafing attacks. Taking off into the middle of the Japanese assault, they engaged the enemy aircraft in aerial combat, shooting down several Zero fighters and dive bombers. Their courageous actions provided hope that American forces could fight back effectively against the Japanese attack. The USS Maryland, moored inboard of the capsized Oklahoma, suffered relatively minor damage during the second wave, but continued to fight back with her anti-aircraft batteries. Her crew had learned from watching the fate of their sister ships and were determined not to become another casualty. The Maryland's survival would prove crucial in the months to come, as every operational battleship would be needed for the long war ahead. As the second wave pressed home their attacks, the harbor defenders were beginning to organize more effective resistance. Anti-aircraft batteries that had been caught unmanned during the first wave were now fully manned and firing continuously. The Japanese pilots found themselves facing a deadly crossfire of machine gun and anti-aircraft fire as they dove toward their targets. The second wave's attack lasted approximately 30 minutes, adding to the destruction already wrought by the first wave. As the Japanese aircraft began their withdrawal, they left behind a harbor transformed into a scene of unprecedented devastation in American military history. Part 4. Heroes in the flames. As the second wave of Japanese aircraft departed, leaving Pearl Harbor shrouded in smoke and flames, individual acts of heroism began emerging from the chaos. The attack had lasted less than 2 hours, but in that brief time, ordinary sailors, soldiers, and civilians had been transformed into heroes whose actions would inspire generations of Americans. Aboard the capsized USS Oklahoma, Seaman First Class James Ward found himself trapped in an air pocket deep within the overturned hull. The ship had rolled completely over, taking hundreds of men with her, but Ward and 31 other survivors were alive in the darkness, waiting for rescue. Above them, rescue crews worked frantically with cutting torches, following the sound of tapping from within the hull. The rescue operation would continue for days, with 32 men eventually pulled alive from the Oklahoma's tomb. The USS Arizona continued to burn throughout the day, her forward magazines still cooking off in smaller explosions that sent shockwaves through the harbor. The ship had become a funeral pyre for over 1,000 men, but her survivors were determined to honor their fallen shipmates. Seaman First Class Donald Stratton, severely burned but alive, was pulled from the Arizona's wreckage by sailors. From the USS Vestal, a repair ship moored alongside the battleship, Stratton's survival story would become one of the most compelling accounts of the Pearl Harbor attack. On Hospital Point, where the USS Nevada had beached herself, Ensign Taussig continued to direct damage control efforts despite his severe leg wound. The Nevada's crew worked tirelessly to control flooding and fight fires, determined to save their ship. Their efforts would prove successful, as the Nevada would eventually be refloated, repaired, and returned to service to fight in the Normandy invasion and other major campaigns, according to oral history accounts collected by the National Park Service. Stories of heroism emerged from every corner of the harbor. Chief Petty Officer John Finn, despite being wounded multiple times, had maintained his machine gun position for over 2 hours, firing at Japanese aircraft until his ammunition was exhausted. His actions earned him the Medal of Honor and the distinction of being the first recipient of America's highest military decoration during World War II. At the submarine base, Lieutenant Commander Samuel Fuqua took charge of damage control efforts aboard the USS Arizona despite being wounded and burned. Fuqua organized firefighting efforts and supervised the evacuation of wounded sailors, remaining at his post until ordered to abandon ship. His leadership under fire earned him the Medal of Honor and saved countless lives during the chaotic hours. After the attack, the hospital at Pearl Harbor was quickly overwhelmed with casualties. Navy nurses, including Chief Nurse Grace Hopper, worked tirelessly to treat the wounded, performing surgery in corridors and makeshift operating rooms as the hospital building shook from nearby explosions. Their dedication and skill saved hundreds of lives during those critical hours. Civilian workers also played crucial roles in the rescue efforts. Joe George, a civilian crane operator, used his equipment to lift debris and rescue trapped sailors from damaged ships. His actions, and those of dozens of other civilian employees, demonstrated that the attack on Pearl Harbor had united all Americans in a common cause. The harbor tugboats became lifelines for the damaged warships. The USS Bobolink and other harbor craft moved between the burning vessels, fighting fires, evacuating wounded sailors, and providing assistance wherever needed. Their crews showed remarkable courage, navigating through oil fires and debris to reach sailors in distress. As evening approached, the full extent of the devastation became clear. 4 battleships had been sunk or destroyed, 4 others damaged, 3 cruisers damaged, 3 destroyers sunk, and numerous smaller vessels destroyed or damaged. The Arizona alone had lost more men than the entire Spanish-American War. The human cost was staggering: 2,403 Americans killed and 1,178 wounded. But alongside the statistics of destruction were the stories of heroism and sacrifice. 15 Medals of Honor would eventually be awarded for actions during the Pearl Harbor attack, more than for any other single day in American military history. These heroes, from admirals to seamen, had faced the ultimate test and had not been found wanting. The fires continued to burn throughout the night, their orange glow visible for miles across the island of Oahu. The attack was over, but the battle for Pearl Harbor had revealed something crucial about the American character. When tested by adversity, ordinary Americans could rise to extraordinary heights of courage and sacrifice. The dawn of December 8, 1941, revealed the full scope of the devastation at Pearl Harbor. The harbor that had been America's Pacific stronghold now resembled a maritime graveyard, with the hulks of mighty warships jutting from the water like steel tombstones. The USS Arizona continued to burn. Her fires would smolder for days, while the capsized USS Oklahoma presented a hull like a beached whale against the morning sky. Rear Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, stood on the shore surveying the destruction of his command. Within hours he would be relieved of command, his career destroyed by the intelligence failures and lack of preparedness that had made the surprise attack possible. But on this morning, his focus was on the immediate crisis: rescuing survivors, fighting fires, and preparing for what many believed would be a Japanese invasion of Hawaii. Throughout Oahu, the civilian population was gripped by fear and uncertainty. Radio broadcasts had been interrupted by emergency announcements, and rumors of Japanese paratroopers and invasion fleets spread rapidly through the island communities. Governor Joseph Poindexter declared martial law, placing the Hawaiian Islands under military control. The multicultural population of Hawaii, including many Americans of Japanese ancestry, faced suspicion and discrimination that would intensify in the months to come. At the White House, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was awakened by a telephone call from Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox. The news of the attack reached Washington at approximately 1:30 in the afternoon Eastern Time. Due to the time difference, Roosevelt's immediate response was to begin planning America's entry into World War II. The conflict he had long believed was inevitable but had hoped to avoid. According to presidential archives, Roosevelt spent the remainder of December 7th meeting with his war cabinet and congressional leaders, crafting the response that would unite the American people behind the war effort. The attack had provided the catalyst that would transform American public opinion from isolationist to interventionist virtually overnight. The rescue operations at Pearl Harbor continued around the clock. Divers worked in the murky, oil-contaminated waters to reach survivors trapped in air pockets within the sunken ships. The most dramatic rescue occurred aboard the USS West Virginia, where 3 sailors were found alive in an air pocket 16 days after the attack. Seaman First Class Ronald Endicott, Clifford Olds, and Louis Costin had survived in complete darkness, rationing emergency rations and fresh water while waiting for rescue. The psychological impact of the attack extended far beyond Hawaii. Across the American mainland, the news of Pearl Harbor shattered the illusion of safety provided by 2 great oceans. In New York, Los Angeles, and other coastal cities, blackout drills were instituted as authorities feared follow-up attacks on the mainland. The American people, who had watched European and Asian conflicts from afar, suddenly found themselves thrust into the center of a global war. Intelligence analysts began the painful process of examining how such a massive attack could have been launched without warning. The failure to properly interpret intercepted Japanese diplomatic communications, the dismissal of radar warnings, and the general state of unpreparedness at Pearl Harbor would become subjects of intense investigation and debate. The Roberts Commission, appointed by President Roosevelt, would conclude that both Admiral Kimmel and General Walter Short, the Army commander in Hawaii, had been derelict in their duties. The industrial mobilization of America began almost immediately. Shipyards that had been building vessels for the British under the Lend-Lease program were retooled for American warship production. The Kaiser shipyards in California began the mass production of Liberty ships, while aircraft factories expanded to meet the demands of a two-ocean war. The attack on Pearl Harbor had awakened not just American resolve, but American industrial might. Personal stories of loss and survival began emerging from the chaos. Families across America learned that their sons, husbands, and fathers had been killed or wounded in the attack. The Sullivan brothers from Iowa, whose deaths aboard the USS Juneau would later inspire military policy changes, enlisted together in the Navy, motivated by the attack on Pearl Harbor. Their story, and thousands of others, illustrated how the attack had transformed American society. The psychological transformation of the American people was perhaps the most significant consequence of the attack. The isolationist movement, which had been powerful enough to keep America out of the European War for over 2 years, collapsed virtually overnight. The America First Committee, led by aviator Charles Lindbergh, disbanded within days of the attack. Pearl Harbor had demonstrated that America could not remain isolated from the global conflict. As December 8th dawned, America was no longer the same nation it had been just 24 hours earlier. The surprise attack that was intended to cripple American naval power had instead awakened a sleeping giant whose industrial capacity and military potential would ultimately prove decisive in the global conflict. On December 8th, 1941, at 12:30 in the afternoon, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt stepped to the podium in the House of Representatives to address a joint session of Congress. The chamber was packed with senators, representatives supreme, court justices, and cabinet members, all waiting to hear how America would respond to the attack on Pearl Harbor. The president's words would not only request a declaration of war, but would also define the moral framework for America's entry into World War II. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Roosevelt began, his voice carrying the weight of history. The phrase, "a date which will live in infamy," had been carefully chosen, replacing the originally drafted, "a date which will live in world history." The president understood that this moment required language that would capture the treachery of the attack and unite the American people in righteous anger. The speech lasted only 6 minutes, but its impact was immediate and profound. Roosevelt detailed the scope of the Japanese attacks, not just at Pearl Harbor, but also at Malaya, Hong Kong, Guam, the Philippines, Wake Island, and Midway Island. The president painted a picture of coordinated aggression that had been planned, while Japanese diplomats were still negotiating in Washington. The duplicity of the attack, launched while peace talks were ongoing, became a central theme of American war propaganda. According to congressional records, the response to Roosevelt's speech was thunderous. The joint session erupted in sustained applause, and when the president concluded with his request for a declaration of war, the chamber rose as one in support. The vote was overwhelmingly in favor of war, 82-0 in the Senate, with only one dissenting vote in the House of Representatives, Congresswoman Jeanette Rankin of Montana, who had also voted against American entry into World War I. Across America, the speech was broadcast live on radio, reaching an estimated 60 million listeners. In living rooms, factories, and public spaces, Americans gathered around their radios to hear their president's words. The response was immediate and dramatic. Military recruiting stations, which had been struggling to meet quotas, were suddenly overwhelmed with volunteers. Young men lined up for blocks to enlist in the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps. The attack on Pearl Harbor had created a sense of national unity that had been absent from American society since the early days of the Great Depression. Regional, ethnic, and political divisions that had seemed insurmountable just days before suddenly became secondary to the common cause of defeating the Axis powers. The isolationist movement, which had commanded significant support in the Midwest and among German Americans and Irish Americans, virtually disappeared overnight. Hollywood responded with remarkable speed to the attack. Within days of Pearl Harbor, movie studios were retooling production schedules to support the war effort. The film industry, which had been criticized for its alleged communist sympathies, threw itself wholeheartedly behind the American war effort. Stars like Clark Gable, Jimmy Stewart, and Henry Fonda would soon be serving in combat roles, while others like Bob Hope and Bing Crosby would entertain troops around the world. The economic impact of the declaration of war was immediate and transformative. The stock market, which had tumbled on December 8th, began a recovery that would last throughout the war. Defense contractors saw their stock prices soar as investors realized that America was about to embark on the largest military buildup in its history. The unemployment that had plagued the nation throughout the Depression began to disappear as factories retooled for wartime production. Personal stories of transformation emerged from every corner of American society. Rosie the Riveter, the iconic symbol of American women's contribution to the war effort, represented millions of women who left traditional roles to work in defense plants. African Americans, despite facing continued discrimination, enlisted in record numbers, seeing the war as an opportunity to prove their patriotism and advance civil rights. The declaration of war also marked the beginning of one of the most controversial aspects of America's World War II experience, the internment of Japanese Americans. Executive Order 9066, signed by President Roosevelt on February 19, 1942, would authorize the forced relocation of over 100,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry to internment camps. The fear and anger generated by Pearl Harbor provided the emotional justification for this massive violation of civil rights. Within 72 hours of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, transforming the conflict from a Pacific war into a truly global struggle. America now faced enemies in both the Atlantic and Pacific, requiring a massive expansion of military forces and industrial production. The two-ocean war would test American capabilities to their limits. The psychological impact of Roosevelt's speech and the declaration of war extended far beyond American borders. In Britain, Winston Churchill received the news with barely contained joy, knowing that American entry into the war virtually guaranteed Allied victory. In the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin welcomed the news that Japan's attack on America made a Japanese attack on Siberia much less likely. The weeks following Pearl Harbor witnessed the most dramatic transformation in American society since the Civil War. The nation that had been reluctant to enter foreign conflicts suddenly found itself committed to a global war on multiple fronts. The industrial, social, and military mobilization that followed would not only win World War II but would establish America as the dominant world power for the remainder of the 20th century. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, reportedly told his staff that they had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. Whether Yamamoto actually spoke these words, or they were the creation of Hollywood scriptwriters, the sentiment accurately captured the Japanese dilemma. The attack had been a tactical success, but a strategic disaster, galvanizing American resolve. Rather than breaking it, The shipbuilding program that emerged from Pearl Harbor was perhaps the most impressive industrial achievement in human history. The Kaiser shipyards, using revolutionary assembly line techniques, began producing Liberty ships at an unprecedented rate. The SS Robert Peary was built in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes, demonstrating American industrial capacity to the world. By the end of the war, American shipyards would produce more vessels than the rest of the world combined. According to industrial production records from the War Production Board, American aircraft production increased from less than 6,000 planes in 1940 to over 96,000 in 1944. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant alone produced over 8,000 B-24 Liberator bombers, earning it the nickname, the Arsenal of Democracy. The transformation of American industry was so complete that by 1943, the United States was producing more military equipment than all the Axis powers combined. The human cost of Pearl Harbor continued to resonate throughout the war. Survivors of the attack carried physical and psychological scars that would last for decades. Seaman First Class Donald Stratton, pulled burning from the USS Arizona, underwent dozens of surgeries and years of rehabilitation. His memoir, written decades later, provided one of the most powerful accounts of survival and recovery from the attack. The USS Arizona became more than just a sunken battleship. It became a symbol of American sacrifice and determination. The decision to leave the Arizona where she sank, rather than raising her like other damaged vessels, created a permanent memorial to the men who died on December 7th. Oil still seeps from the Arizona's hull, creating what visitors call the Tears of the Arizona, a perpetual reminder of the price of unpreparedness. The intelligence failures that had made Pearl Harbor possible led to the creation of more centralized intelligence services. The Office of Strategic Services, predecessor to the Central Intelligence Agency, was established to coordinate intelligence gathering and analysis. The lesson of Pearl Harbor, that America could not afford to be surprised again, would shape American intelligence and defense policy for generations. The social transformation of America was equally dramatic. The Bracero program brought Mexican workers to American farms to replace men who had joined the military. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, fundamentally changing American society. The Great Migration of African Americans from the rural South to industrial cities accelerated, as defense jobs offered opportunities previously unavailable. Pearl Harbor survivors became living links to the attack, their stories keeping the memory alive for new generations. Annual memorial services on December 7th became important national observances, reminding Americans of the price of freedom and the importance of remaining vigilant against threats to democracy. The attack also had profound consequences for the Japanese American community. The fear and anger generated by Pearl Harbor led to the internment of over 100,000 Japanese Americans, most of whom were American citizens. This massive violation of civil rights, upheld by the Supreme Court in Korematsu v. United States, remains one of the most shameful episodes in American history. The injustice was partially addressed by the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which provided monetary reparations to surviving internees. The strategic consequences of Pearl Harbor extended far beyond the immediate military damage. The attack convinced American leaders that isolationism was no longer viable in an interconnected world. The United Nations, NATO, and other international institutions that America would lead after the war all traced their origins to the lessons learned from Pearl Harbor. The attack on Pearl Harbor had intended to prevent American interference with Japanese expansion in the Pacific. Instead, it guaranteed American involvement in World War II and ultimately led to Japanese defeat. The sleeping giant had indeed awakened, and its terrible resolve would not only win the war, but would reshape the global order for decades to come. Today, The USS Arizona Memorial stands as a testament to the sacrifice of those who died on December 7, 1941. The memorial receives over 1 million visitors annually, ensuring that the memory of Pearl Harbor and its lessons continue to educate new generations about the price of freedom and the importance of remaining vigilant in its defense. The attack that was meant to end American resistance instead began America's rise to global leadership. From the flames and destruction of Pearl Harbor emerged a more unified, determined, and powerful America, one that would not only win World War II, but would lead the free world in the struggles that lay ahead.